The gavel fell like thunder, and the courtroom froze. Outside, Moscow's streets lay buried in snow, but inside, silence burned hotter than fire. The judge's lips parted, his voice a blade slicing through the boy's last hope. One word, one eternity, a sentence heavier than death. The boy's knees buckled. He was only 17, his hands still carrying the callouses of childhood, his eyes too young to have learned despair, yet despair devoured him now. Shackles clinked as guards pulled him away, but his voice broke through the air before they could silence him. Father! And the room shuddered, for this was no ordinary plea. This was not the cry of a criminal, but of a son reaching for the shadow of a man who sat among the crowd, a man who was both executioner and savior, both blood and betrayal. The U.S. Attorney General, his face carved of stone, did not rise, did not weep, did not claim his child. Only his trembling hands beneath the oak table betrayed the storm inside him. The world thought the boy was lost. But the story was only beginning, because love can rot into vengeance. Secrets can bleed into revolutions, and one Russian winter can turn a family's shame into a nation's fire. Life. The word fell from the judge's lips like the cold weight of an iron chain, echoing through the courtroom with a finality that no appeal could soften. The boy, barely 17, stood frozen in his dark suit that looked borrowed, shoulders too narrow for the stiff fabric. He felt the world tilt, as though the ornate courtroom with its carved wood and orthodox icons had become a cavern swallowing him whole. His fingers twitched. He did not cry, nor plead, nor shout. He only turned his head, searching through the blur of faces until his eyes found the one that mattered. The tall man in the back, standing rigid, with a sharp jaw and eyes that belonged not to a father but to an institution. The boy's lips parted. His voice cracked. It was not just a father he called. It was the U.S. Attorney General, the man who had raised him between courtrooms and cold apartments, between long winters and the silence of men who had forgotten tenderness. In that single word, the boy reached for love that had been buried under power, under politics. Under the heavy snow of their shared silences, the father did not move. He stood as though a statue carved from Siberian ice, his black coat brushing the polished floor, his hands clasped in front of him. Around him, whispers rose, not about the verdict, not about the boy, but about him. The Attorney General, the symbol of law, now stripped of it by the bond of blood. The gavel struck. The chains were brought. The boy was led away, his steps clumsy, like a child caught in a storm. The courtroom emptied, the smell of wax polish and old wood lingering in the air. Snow fell beyond the high windows, slow and silent like white ashes. Outside, the streets of Moscow stretched gray and endless, coated in ice. The father stepped into the winter, his breath rising in clouds. He did not follow his son to the van, did not watch the iron door close. Instead, he turned toward the cathedral across the square, golden domes burning faintly against the pale sky. He walked with the slow determination of a man carrying both a burden and a secret. He had always believed in justice, but justice had no face when it came for his child. At the prison gates, the boy was swallowed by the system. His head buzzed with voices, his heart ached with the weight of betrayal, yet inside, another fire stirred. Not the fire of despair, but of memory. He thought of his grandmother, the woman who had fed him black bread and borscht in the village when his father was away. He thought of her stories whispered by the stove, stories of wolves in the forest, of men who broke oaths, of women who carried secrets heavier than stone. She had pressed into his hands an old wooden cross, worn smooth by years of prayer. It now hung under his shirt, warm against his skin. In the cold cell, the boy gripped it tightly. The nights in the prison stretched long. Snowflakes drifted against the barred windows, glowing faintly in the dim light. He listened to the mutterings of other inmates, the cries, the curses, the silence heavy as earth. Yet he also listened to his own heartbeat, steady, stubborn, unbroken. Meanwhile, his father returned to the old apartment on Arbat Street. The place smelled of dust and tea leaves, the furniture dark with age. On the wall hung a faded photograph, his late wife, wrapped in a fur coat, her eyes soft but distant. As though she had always known she would leave too soon, he poured himself a glass of vodka, sat at the wooden table, and stared at the photograph. "You would know what to do," he whispered, though the words were heavy with guilt. for he knew she had known his secrets, the secrets that had now come to claim their son. In the village beyond Moscow, the grandmother lit a candle before the icon of the Virgin. She wore a wool scarf, her hands trembling with age, but steady in prayer. She had heard of the sentence, "Word travels fast in villages, where the snow carries whispers from house to house." She did not weep, she prayed, for she knew that the boy was not guilty of what the world claimed. His crime was not his own, but tied to the sins of others. The prison became both punishment and mirror. Days passed like seasons, marked by bread rations and the clang of metal. The boy's cellmate was a man with a scar running across his cheek, a thief who had once stolen fur coats from markets in St. Petersburg. He taught the boy how to survive. Keep your back to the wall. Never eat from another man's bowl. Never forget who you are. They'll try to strip you of that. But at night, when the others slept, the boy pressed his hand to the cross and whispered not prayers, but names his mother, his grandmother, even his father. The sound of his own voice in the darkness kept him from dissolving into silence. And beyond those walls, life moved like the Moscow River under ice. The father visited no one, spoke to no one, but at dawn he often walked to the cathedral, standing among the poor, the beggars, the women in scarves who crossed themselves with trembling fingers. He did not pray. He only stood as though waiting for something greater than himself to rise from the incense smoke and the candlelight. But one evening he returned home to find an envelope slid under his door. Inside was a letter written in a trembling hand. It was from my grandmother. He is not guilty, not of this. You know it. What is buried will return. The sins of fathers do not sleep under snow. Come to the village. The truth waits in the house by the forest. The Attorney General sat long at the table, staring at those words. His hands shook, and he poured another glass, though it did nothing to warm him. The truth was a ghost he had long buried in that very village, in that house by the forest, in the life he had abandoned when ambition had called him to Moscow. He closed his eyes. He saw her face again, not his wife's, but another's. A woman with hair black as night, standing in the snow with a child in her arms. He had left them behind. The vodka burned his throat, but the image burned deeper. The boy in his cell dreamed that night of a forest thick with snow, of wolves pacing among the trees, their eyes glowing. And in the dream, he heard a woman's voice, soft, distant, calling his name. He woke with his heart racing, the wooden cross hot against his skin. The grandmother's candle burned low in the village. She hummed an old hymn, one her own mother had sung during war years, when hunger gnawed but faith remained. She knew the past was rising like thawed river water, unstoppable, ready to break through the dam of silence. The snow fell heavier in Moscow. The Attorney General took his black coat from the hook and prepared to leave. His steps echoed in the stairwell, his shadow long against the peeling walls. He knew that in the village waited not only for truth but reckoning. The boy pressed his palm to the bars of his window and watched the snow swirl. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, faint, solemn, eternal. And thus, the threads of father, son, and past began to draw tighter, weaving toward a truth that could not remain buried under snow forever. The train creaked as it left Moscow, wheels grinding against the frozen rails, smoke rising in heavy clouds that blurred the skyline. Inside one of the worn compartments, the Attorney General sat stiffly, his gloved hands resting on his knees. The coat collar was turned up, hiding half his face, but nothing could hide the weight in his eyes. Around him, peasants murmured in low voices, clutching sacks of potatoes, jars of pickles, and baskets wrapped in cloth. The smell of smoked fish lingered, mixed with the sharpness of vodka and winter air. He did not belong among them. His polished boots, his silence, the way he avoided their gaze, all marked him as a man from another world. Yet he had chosen this path, back to the village where his past lay buried under snow and shame. The train rattled through endless forests, birch trees standing like pale sentinels, their bark glowing faintly in the dim light. He remembered walking through such forests as a young man, his hands still soft, his heart not yet hardened. He had left behind not only a village but also a promise to a woman who had believed in him, who had given him her love without asking for anything except his presence. He had broken it as easily as one breaks a piece of black bread. When the train stopped at a small station, the platform half buried in snow, he stepped down. The wind cut his face, sharp as a knife. Villagers shuffled past, their scarves tied tightly, their breaths puffing in clouds. A horse-drawn sleigh waited at the edge of the road, the driver wrapped in a fur coat patched with age. To the forest village, the Attorney General said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like it belonged to another man. The driver only nodded, clicking his tongue to the horse. The sleigh slid across the snow, the bells jingling faintly. Wooden houses appeared in the distance, roofs heavy with white, smoke rising in thin lines from crooked chimneys. Children in woolen mittens chased each other, their laughter echoing against the stillness. Old women stood in doorways, their scarves tied beneath their chins, their eyes watchful. Life here moved slowly, untouched by Moscow's power, yet sharper in its truths. At the edge of the village stood a house leaning slightly, its windows glowing with the light of a single lamp. He knew it at once. The house by the forest. His steps faltered, though the snow seemed to push him forward. The door opened before he knocked. The grandmother stood there, her back bent, her scarf covering silver hair. Her eyes were pale, but they held a fire that had not dimmed with age. "You came," she said simply. He lowered his head, unable to speak. She turned, and he followed her inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and old pine. Icons covered the walls, their gold paint faded but sacred. A samovar hissed gently on the table, steam rising like a prayer. He removed his gloves slowly, his hands trembling. "You have hidden long enough," she said. 2 cups of tea. The snow does not hide everything, it melts. And when it melts, the earth speaks. He looked at her, his jaw tightening. He has been sentenced. Life. My son. Our son. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The grandmother's eyes did not flicker. She poured the tea, the dark liquid steaming in the cup. "I told you. The sins of fathers find the children. You thought your position, your name, would protect him. But the blood remembers." He gripped the cup, though the heat seared his skin. Memories flooded him. The woman's laughter, her hands kneading dough by the stove, her hair braided and smelling of smoke. He had loved her, once, in the quiet way a man loves when he still belongs to himself. But he had left her when Moscow called, when ambition grew louder than affection. She had borne his child alone. That child, his child, now bore the sentence of life. The grandmother leaned closer. "He is not guilty. You know it, the crime is not his. It belongs to the men you served, the secrets you kept. Do not let him carry your sins." The Attorney General closed his eyes, pain carving lines into his face. He remembered the trial, the evidence, the witnesses. He remembered the silence he had kept, the silence that condemned his own blood. For he had known all along that the boy's arrest was not about justice, but about punishment. Punishment for the father, for the man who had crossed too many men of power, who had held too many truths in his hands. Tapped softly at the window. The grandmother lit another candle, her lips moving in silent prayer. "You must choose," she said. "The law you serve or the son you made. Moscow will not forgive. But God will see." He could not answer. The tea cooled in his cup, untouched. His heart beat with the heavy rhythm of a man torn between 2 altars, one of power, one of blood. In the prison, the boy lay awake on the wooden bunk. His cellmate snored, the sound rattling against the walls. He stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks with his eyes, imagining they were rivers on a map leading him somewhere beyond these walls. He thought of his father. Cold, distant, unreachable, and wondered if calling him in the courtroom had been foolish. But he also thought of his grandmother. Her kitchen smelled of rye bread and apples baked with honey. She would be praying for him now, her lips moving, her fingers clutching the rosary. He whispered her name into the darkness, and for a moment, the cell felt less like a tomb. Days blurred into weeks. Snowstorms howled outside, shaking the prison windows. Letters came rarely, censored and cut. But one morning, the guard shoved a small envelope through the bars. The boy tore it open, his hands trembling. Inside was a scrap of paper with only 3 words written in his grandmother's shaky hand: "The truth waits." He pressed the paper to his lips. Something inside him shifted, like a flame sparking in ashes. He would wait. He would endure. But he would not break. In the village, the Attorney General sat long into the night, staring at the flickering lamp, listening to the grandmother's breathing in the other room. He knew the time had come to decide, to confront the men in Moscow who had orchestrated his son's fall, or to remain silent and let the boy rot in the shadows of prison. The snow outside deepened, covering the roads, the roofs, the fields. Yet under that silence, something stirred. Old secrets, hidden betrayals, truths that would no longer sleep. The father rose from the table, his shadow stretching long across the wooden floor. His heart was heavy, but for the first time in years, it was not hollow. He would go back to Moscow, and this time, he would not return empty. The train back to Moscow rattled through the night, its iron wheels singing against the frozen tracks. Inside his compartment, the Attorney General sat alone, his hat pulled low, the lamplight flickering across the pale scars of sleeplessness on his face. He was not the same man who had left days ago. Something had cracked in him at the village, something the silence of the grandmother's house and the smell of pine resin and candle wax had awakened. He carried no papers, no allies, no guarantees. Only a decision heavier than the snow piling outside the window. The city emerged at dawn, a blur of smoke and chimneys, onion domes glistening faintly under a pale sun. Moscow was always hungry, always swallowing men whole, no matter their rank. He stepped onto the platform, the bitter wind cutting through his coat, and moved quickly into the crowd, his face unreadable. He did not go home. Not yet. Instead, he walked through narrow streets where children dragged sleds across icy pavements and vendors sold steaming pies filled with cabbage and potato. His boots echoed in the alleys until he reached a door hidden behind a courtyard. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked once more. The door opened to reveal a man with a thick beard and wary eyes. His coat smelled of tobacco, his fingers stained with ink. He was not a friend, but neither was he an enemy. He was a journalist, one who had once written too boldly about corruption, only to vanish into silence when the weight of the state pressed down. "You shouldn't be here." The journalist muttered, pulling him inside. "Your name draws fire. I bring fire." The Attorney General replied, his voice hoarse. "And I no longer care who burns." The journalist's apartment was small, crowded with books, typewriters, and the faint perfume of mold. The wall hung an icon of St. Nicholas, its glass cracked. The Attorney General removed his gloves, his eyes sharp. "My son is in prison. Life sentence. You know the case." The journalist nodded grimly. "Everyone knows. They say he killed a man in a brawl. But those who listen to whispers know it was arranged. Your enemies wanted to break you." "They did not break me," he said quietly. "But they may have broken him. Truth is spoken." The journalist leaned forward. "You understand what you ask. Once the truth leaves my hands, it cannot be hidden again. They will come for you, for him, for anyone who dares to carry your name." The Attorney General's jaw tightened. "Then let them come. I have carried silence too long. Silence is a colder prison than stone walls." The journalist studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He pulled out a bottle of vodka, poured 2 glasses, and slid one across the table. "Then speak. Begin at the beginning. Tell me what they buried." And so he spoke. His voice, once polished for courtrooms, now cracked like old wood as he unfolded the story. The deals made behind velvet curtains, the crimes washed clean with signatures, the witnesses silenced with robles and fear. And beneath it all, his own sin, the betrayal of the boy's mother, the abandonment that left the child without protection, easy prey for enemies when revenge came. The journalist wrote in silence, the keys clacking softly, like bones rattling. By the time the glass lamp burned low, the Attorney General had poured out not just the truth of the case, but the truth of his own life, a confession dressed in the language of law. When he finished, his hands shook. The journalist placed a cigarette between his lips and lit it. Smoke curled upward, carrying with it the weight of what had been spoken. "This," the journalist said slowly, "is more than one boy's sentence. It is a wound at the heart of the state. If it bleeds in public, the walls will tremble. Then let them tremble." The Attorney General replied. His eyes were tired, but beneath them burned a light that had not been there in years. Meanwhile, in the prison, the boy sat in the yard where snow covered the cracked stones. Prisoners shuffled around, their breaths rising like smoke. He stood apart, his thin frame hunched, his eyes watching the sky. He thought of his father, but did not know whether to hate him or to hope. The scarred cellmate approached, his voice low. "You walk like a man waiting for angels." The boy looked at him, puzzled. "They don't come here," the man said, smirking. "Only wolves." But that night, as the boy lay awake, he dreamed again of the forest. He heard footsteps in the snow, a woman's voice calling his name. He reached for her, but she faded into mist, leaving only the sound of bells ringing across the trees. He woke with tears frozen on his cheeks. The article appeared quietly, almost hidden, in the pages of a small newspaper few dared to buy. But the words were fire. They spread from hands to whispers, from whispers to shouts. Soon, in tea houses and train stations, in the kitchens of workers and the offices of lawyers, people spoke of the boy, not as a murderer, but as a sacrifice, a symbol of corruption. Moscow stirred. The Attorney General walked the streets without fear, though he knew eyes followed him, shadows lengthened behind him. One evening, as he returned to his apartment, a black car stood by the curb. Two men in coats stepped out, their faces expressionless. "You should not have spoken," one said. He met their gaze without flinching. "You should not have silenced." They said nothing more. They left as silently as they came, but the message was clear. The storm was rising. In the village, the grandmother heard of the article. She lit candles for her grandson, her prayers fierce, her voice trembling as she sang hymns into the night. Villagers gathered, whispering that the old woman's bloodline was cursed and blessed both. She ignored them. She knew the truth was like spring thaw. Once begun, it cannot be stopped. Weeks passed. Pressure mounted. Trials were whispered about, resignations rumored. The boy remained in his cell, unaware of the waves crashing outside. But one morning, the guards came, their boots heavy, their eyes avoiding him. "Pack your things," one muttered. He did not ask why. He gathered the little he owned. A wooden cross, a scrap of paper, a piece of bread. He was led through corridors, gates, and snow-laden courtyards. The cold bit his cheeks, but his heart raced. At the end of the road, a carriage waited. Not a prison van, a simple carriage drawn by two horses. He froze, confusion spreading through him. The guard pushed him forward. "Go!" He climbed in, clutching his bundle. The horses moved, the bells jingling faintly. He did not know where he was going or why. Only that the air felt different, freer, even if only for a moment. That night, the Attorney General sat in his apartment, staring at a telegram on the table. It bore only 4 words. "The boy is moved." He closed his eyes. The storm had broken. The pieces were shifting. But whether it would save his son, or destroy them both, he did not yet know. Snow fell heavy against the windows, muffling the city's roar. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang at midnight, and in that sound, for the first time, he prayed. The road stretched endlessly under the horses' hooves, snow muffling their rhythm, moonlight glazing the fields in silver. The boy sat in the carriage, his hands clasped around the wooden cross beneath his shirt. His breath rose in clouds, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not know whether he was being freed or led to another prison. The silence of the guards who had delivered him to this sleigh had been deliberate, as though silence itself were a weapon. The driver did not speak. His fur hat was pulled low, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Only the jingling of the sleigh bells marked time as they moved deeper into the countryside, away from the black walls of the prison and the choking smoke of Moscow. Hours passed. At last the carriage stopped before a monastery, domes dark against the snowy sky, its bells silent as if holding their breath. Candles glowed faintly in the windows, their light trembling in the night wind. The driver gestured. "Go." The boy climbed down, his legs stiff, heart pounding. The gate creaked open, and a monk in a wool robe stood waiting. His beard was long, his eyes shadowed with both age and patience. "You are safe here," the monk said simply, though his voice carried no warmth. "For now." Inside the monastery, the air smelled of incense and old wood. Icons lined the walls, flickering with candlelight. The boy was led to a small cell, not of iron, but of stone, with a simple bed and a crucifix carved into the wall. Bread and tea waited on the table. He sat down, uncertain. Safe. No prison bars, no guards with rifles, yet he felt no freedom. Only another kind of silence, one that pressed against him from all sides. That night, he dreamed again of the forest. Snow fell heavy on the pines, and a woman's voice called him, nearer now, clearer. He turned toward it, and for the first time, He saw her face, pale, with dark eyes and hair braided over her shoulder. She lifted her hand toward him, but before he could touch her, the bells rang, loud and urgent, waking him. In Moscow, the Attorney General moved like a marked man. His apartment was watched. Shadows lingered at the corners of streets. Yet he carried himself with a strange calm, file as though fear had already burned away. The journalist's article had spread beyond the city. Copies were smuggled into villages, read aloud in kitchens by lamplight, discussed in whispers at train stations. The boy's name became a question on people's lips, a question heavier than law: who is guilty? The son or the father? In the Duma, behind heavy doors, his enemies plotted. Men in suits spoke his name like a curse, debating whether to silence him permanently or let him destroy himself with his own defiance. One man, lean and sharp-eyed, declared, "He is no longer useful." The boy was the lever. Now the lever is broken. But power is never clean. A man whose truth already bleeds is like trying to freeze a river in spring. The grandmother in the village felt the change in the air. She walked to the forest, her boots sinking into snow, her scarf pulled tight against the wind. She stopped by the old birch tree where she had once met the boy's mother in secret, where promises had been whispered and broken. She laid her hands on the bark, whispering prayers not in church language, but in the older tongue, the folk prayers of her ancestors, half Christian, half pagan, woven from earth and sky. "Protect him," she murmured. "The blood of his father cannot drown him. Let him carry his own fate, not the sins of those before." Her breath froze in the air, and for a moment she thought she heard footsteps in the forest. But when she turned, there was only silence and snow. Days at the monastery passed in a rhythm of bells and prayers. The boy swept floors, carried buckets of water from the well, and listened to the monks chant in the cold chapel. Their voices rose like smoke, filling the vaulted ceiling with sorrow and light. But the boy's heart was restless. He longed for answers. Why he had been brought here, who had decided it, what his father had done. He approached the monk who had first greeted him, a man named Father Alexei, whose eyes seemed to see through stone. The boy asked. The monk studied him. "Because you are both innocent and guilty. Because the world outside hungers for you, and here you may yet live to see another spring." The boy frowned. "Innocent and guilty. I don't understand." "You will," the monk said softly. "When you understand your father." The words struck like a blade. He turned away, clutching the cross beneath his shirt. His father, always the shadow, always the silence. Perhaps the monastery was only another prison, but one with walls built of his father's sins. One evening, as snow fell thick over the city, the Attorney General received a visitor. A woman in a long fur coat stepped into his apartment. Her perfume faint, her eyes sharp. She was not from the village, not from his past, but from the present. A colleague, once an ally, now something harder to name. "They are watching you," she said, sitting gracefully at his table. "You know what happens to men who defy them." "I know," he replied. "And yet you go on." He poured her tea, though his hands trembled. "What else is left for me? My son carries chains for my silence. I will not let him carry them for my voice." She studied him, her fingers wrapped around the glass. "And if your voice destroys more than it saves, then let it destroy," he said, his voice low. "Perhaps only ashes can cleanse what is rotten." The woman did not answer. She left as silently as she had come, but her presence lingered like incense. In the monastery, the boy knelt in the chapel, the cold stone biting his knees. Candles flickered before the icons, the Virgin's face soft, the saint's eyes stern. He closed his eyes and whispered not prayers, but questions. "Why me? Why him? Why us?" Silence answered, heavy and vast. Yet in that silence stirred not words, but a strange strength, like the weight of snow pressing branches until they bend, but do not break. He rose, his breath unsteady, but his gaze clearer. In Moscow, the Attorney General prepared his next step. The article had been fire, now he needed thunder. He wrote letters, not to allies, he had none left, but to the people, to priests, to mothers who had lost sons, to fathers who had buried daughters. His words carried no titles, no rank, only the raw confession of a man who had broken and now sought redemption. At night, he walked the streets, listening to the murmurs in taverns and courtyards. He saw his son's face in every boy selling apples, in every soldier's hollow eyes. The city itself seemed to pulse with his guilt. One evening, standing on the bridge over the Moscow River, he watched the ice shift and crack. The sound was deep ancient, like the earth itself groaning. He thought of his son, the boy dreaming in some unknown place, the boy whose life was now bound to his choices. "Forgive me," he whispered into the wind, though he did not know if the words were meant for God, for his son, or for the woman he had once abandoned. The river did not answer. But the ice broke, and the water surged beneath, black and relentless. And so the threads drew tighter, the boy in his monastery prison, the father in his city prison, the grandmother in her village prayers. Snow fell over them all, equal and merciless, covering sins and secrets alike. Yet the thaw would come, and with it truths too heavy to remain buried. The monastery bells tolled at dawn, their iron tongues shaking the frosted air. The boy rose from his narrow bed, the wool blanket still damp with his restless dreams. The monastery lived by rhythm prayers at sunrise, labor by day, silence at night. But inside him, no rhythm held. His pulse beat faster than the monk's chants, faster than the falling snow. Father Alexei, tall and stooped, led him to the library one morning. Dust lay thick on the shelves, where bound books leaned like wary travelers. "Read," the monk said. "Not all prisons are made of stone. Some are ignorant." The boy traced the spines with trembling fingers: Orthodox Psalters, Russian Chronicles, collections of folk tales. One book lay open on a table, ink faded, its margins filled with notes in a hand he half recognized. He bent closer, his breath caught. It was his father's handwriting. The words were fierce, filled with arguments about justice, about law, about truth. Written years ago, long before the Attorney General had become the polished figure of the state. The boy touched the page as if touching the skin of a stranger who was also kin. "Why is this here?" he asked. Father Alexei's eyes gleamed. "Your father came here once, long ago, when he was still a man searching for himself. He left part of his soul in these pages. You must decide if you will claim it or reject it." The boy clenched his fists. He remembered the cold face in the courtroom, the silence that followed his plea. How could this man who wrote of truth condemn his own son to chains? But still, he read. For days he sat in the library, the monks moving silently around him. While snow whispered against the windows, he read his father's words, and with each line, the wall between them cracked, though anger still burned in the gaps. In Moscow, the Attorney General was no longer invisible, had spread like sparks across dry grass. Priests read them from pulpits, their voices trembling but unbroken. Mothers carried copies folded into the lining of their coats. Even soldiers whispered them across barracks. And so came the retaliation. One evening, as he returned to his apartment, he found the door ajar. Inside, the room lay torn apart, drawers overturned, papers scattered, the photograph of his late wife shattered on the floor. He knelt to pick up the broken glass, blood running from his palm, but he did not curse. He only stared at the image of her eyes, split by a crack, as if even the dead were not safe from vengeance. That night, he slept not in his bed but in the shadows of the cathedral, where beggars huddled under blankets and old women clutched rosaries. The incense thick in the air, he whispered his confession to no priest, only to the flickering candle flames. "I gave him life but not love. Now I must give him freedom, even if I lose mine." Outside, the wind rose, sweeping snow into spirals, carrying his words into the city like sparks into darkness. The boy's restlessness grew. The monastery walls felt less like sanctuary and more like chains made of silence. One night, unable to bear it, he slipped from his cell and wandered the cloisters. The moon spilled light across the stone, casting shadows of arches and crosses. In the chapel, he found Father Alexei kneeling before the icons, his head bowed. "You cannot sleep," the monk said without looking up. "Why am I here?" the boy demanded. His voice echoed. "Am I hidden to be saved, or to be forgotten?" Alexei rose slowly, his beard trembling in the candlelight. "You are here because your father asked for it. He believes this place keeps you from death." The boy's throat tightened. "Then he condemns me twice, to prison, now to silence. Or perhaps," Alexei said, "seeks to buy time. Time for truth to reach you. Time for you to know him, not as a mask of power, but as a man." The boy turned away, tears hot on his cheeks. A man who abandoned me. Alexei laid a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes men abandon what they love most, not because they do not love, but because they are too weak to protect it. Your father's sin was not hatred, cowardice. The boy stood frozen. Cowardice. The word burned deeper than hatred. He clenched the cross at his chest and left the chapel without speaking. In the village, the grandmother felt her bones ache as the snow deepened. She sensed storms not of weather but of fate. One evening, as she boiled potatoes and cabbage in her iron pot, a knock came at the door. A stranger stood there. A soldier, thin and pale, his uniform worn. He carried no weapon, only a folded paper. "For you?" he said, his eyes downcast. She unfolded it. It was one of the Attorney General's letters, copied in ink, the words trembling but clear. She read aloud, her voice steady. "Justice is not law written in books, but truth written in blood. If I must spill mine to free my son, let it be so." The soldier whispered, "Men in barracks speak of it. Some call him a traitor. Some call him prophet." The grandmother crossed herself. "He is both, and both shall bring suffering." The city turned restless. Demonstrations rose, first small, then swelling. Workers gathering in the squares, priests blessing them, students shouting words that once had been forbidden. "Free the boy! Free the truth!" The Attorney General walked among them, not as a leader but as a presence, silent and tall. His black coat brushed the snow, his eyes hollow but burning. People touched his sleeve as he passed, as though he were both man and symbol. The state responded with force. Soldiers marched, rifles gleaming, boots pounding the stones. Yet hesitation glimmered in their eyes. For many had read his words, many had lost their own brothers to silence. One officer shouted for the crowd to disperse. The crowd answered with a hymn, voices rising against rifles. The Attorney General stood at the front, his hands raised not in defiance, but in surrender to something greater. Snow fell heavier, heaven itself wept. At the monastery, news trickled in. A monk whispered to the boy that the city burned with unrest, that his father's name was on every tongue. The boy's heart pounded. Anger clashed with longing, grief with pride. He wanted to despise his father, yet the image of him standing among the people sent a heat through his chest. That night, he returned to the library. He read his father's words again, the ink trembling like veins on the page. He whispered aloud, "Justice is not law written in books, but truth written in blood." And for the first time, he felt the weight of that blood. His father's, his own, the generations before. One evening, Father Alexei entered his cell with a lantern. He said, "Time for what?" the boy asked. "For you to see him. He comes." The boy's breath caught. His father? Here? In this cloistered silence? He rose, his legs trembling, his heart torn between rage and desperate longing. The lantern's glow flickered against the stone walls as Alexei led him through the cloisters. Beyond the chapel doors, snow swirled in the courtyard, and there, framed by the storm, stood the Attorney General, his black coat dusted white, his face hollowed by nights without sleep, yet his eyes alive. Father and son faced each other, silence thick as snow. Neither moved, neither spoke. Everything unsaid hung between them, love and betrayal, guilt and hope, life and chains. The bells tolled, shaking the air, as though the heavens themselves demanded the truth to break at last. The bells quivered through the stone, their iron tongues echoing into the snowy dusk. Father and son stood still, a frozen tableau in the monastery courtyard. The monks lingered at the edges, shadows in hoods, watching yet silent, for they knew they were witnessing more than a meeting. They were witnessing the clash of blood, the trembling of two fates bound by guilt and defiance. The Attorney General's breath rose in pale clouds. His face seemed carved from the same stone that lined the cloister's stern, gray, unyielding. But his eyes, they betrayed him. They flickered like candles caught in the wind, uncertain whether to burn or die. The boy's chest heaved. His fingers clenched the rough wool of his robe. He wanted to spit, to cry, to strike, collapse into those tired arms. But he could not. For years, he had held one truth, that his father had abandoned him. Yet here was another truth standing before him, alive and broken, daring him to choose which one to believe. "Why?" the boy whispered. His voice cracked like ice breaking on the river. The Attorney General swallowed. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, melting as though the storm itself wept for him. "I feared losing you." The boy laughed bitterly. You lost me the moment you condemned me. The attorney's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, boots crunching on snow. I condemned you to save you. The court was no place for mercy. If I had fought, they would have buried you deeper. Life in prison was the only bargain I could buy. The boy's eyes widened, his heart a storm of fury and confusion. So you chose chains over courage. Silence stretched, vast as the fields beyond the walls. Then the attorney whispered, Yes, and I have hated myself every hour since. The boy turned away, tears carving heat down his frozen skin. The monastery bells fell silent, as if granting them the terrible mercy of stillness. Father Alexei stepped forward, the lantern trembling in his hand. Words are wounds, but wounds may bleed into healing. Speak now, or regret forever. The Attorney General's voice hardened. They hunt me. My letters have become fire, and fire burns all who touch it. I came here not to beg for forgiveness, but to give you a choice. The boy faced him again, trembling. A choice. To flee, or to fight. The state will come here soon. They know I am gone from the city. They will search the churches, the villages, even these walls. If you remain, you will be taken again. If you flee, you may live. But in exile, far from me, far from Russia. The boy shook his head violently. And if I fight? The attorney's eyes glistened. Then you will stand beside me, and you will bear the cost. The snow thickened, swirling around them like the shroud of destiny. That night, father and son sat together for the first time in years, a single candle between them in the monastery's refectory. The monks had left them in silence, only the wind howling through the shutters. The attorney removed his gloves. His hands were raw, his knuckles bruised, the skin torn from nights of marching in protests, from lifting banners instead of gavels. He poured tea into a chipped cup and pushed it toward his son. The boy stared at the steam, at the trembling surface, lifted it to his lips. Neither spoke for a long time. Then the boy whispered, When I was a child, you promised me Moscow would be mine, that I would walk its streets without fear. The attorney bowed his head. Yes, the boy said. But his voice carried not hatred now, but wariness, the ache of too many lonely winters. You failed me, but you are still my father. The attorney's eyes closed, and for the first time in decades, he wept. Not the controlled tears of grief, but the raw sobs of a man stripped of his armor. His son did not reach across the table, but he did not turn away either. Meanwhile, the city boiled. Demonstrations swelled into riots. Soldiers hesitated, priests shielded protesters, mothers carried icons into the streets. The Attorney General's words had become a gospel of resistance. The state called him a traitor, foreign spy, and heretic. His photograph appeared on posters nailed to wooden poles, his eyes crossed out in black ink, but the people whispered otherwise. He is a father. He is all our fathers. The grandmother in the village heard the whispers too. She lit candles every night, praying not for victory but for mercy, for fate to spare her grandson's young years. The soldier who had brought her the letter returned, thinner, hungrier, but his eyes brighter. People march still, he told her. Even when beaten, they rise again. She pressed a piece of black bread into his hand. Then go. Carry their strength with you. But remember, revolutions eat their own children. The soldier kissed her hand and vanished into the storm. Back at the monastery, the boy paced the cloisters like a caged wolf. His father watched him, silent, torn between pride and fear. At last, the boy spoke. I will not flee. I will not be hidden. If they take me, let them. But if I must die, I will die as your son, not as your Shandor. The attorney's hands trembled. Then we stand together. And so they made their pact. Days later, the soldiers came. Boots thundered on the monastery stones, rifles gleaming beneath the winter sun. Monks scattered like frightened birds, though some stood firm, clutching wooden crosses to their chests. The attorney and his son walked into the courtyard, side by side, unchained but unarmed. The commander barked orders, demanding surrender. The attorney raised his voice, strong, clear, carrying through the snow. You cannot change the truth forever. The crowd of villagers who had gathered beyond the gates cried out in answer. The soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their rifles. Others raised them higher. The boy stepped forward, his chest heaving. If you take him, you take me too. I am his blood, his witness, his proof. For a moment, silence ruled the courtyard. Snow fell thick, covering rifles, coats, faces. Then, a shot. Screams tore the air. The boy staggered, clutching his side, crimson blooming against the white snow. The attorney caught him, his arms trembling, his face pale with horror. The commander shouted for order, but chaos erupted. Villagers stormed the gates, monks cried out prayers, soldiers faltered. The attorney held his son, blood soaking his coat. "Stay with me," he begged. "Stay." The boy's lips moved, faint, broken. Not chains, not silence, only the truth. And then his head fell against his father's chest. The attorney roared, not like a man, but like a wounded beast. His cry carried through the monastery walls, through the village, through the storm. A sound of grief that split heaven itself. The boy's body was carried into the chapel, laid before the icons, candles flickering around him. The monks prayed, the villagers wept, and soldiers stood trembling, their rifles useless in the presence of such sorrow. The attorney knelt beside his son, his hands covered in blood that was both curse and baptism. He kissed the boy's forehead and whispered, "Forgive me." And as dawn broke, the snow turned red outside the chapel, and the bells tolled once more. Not in rhythm of prayer, but in mourning, yet among the villagers a new whisper rose. He died for truth. He died for all of us.